Talk about empires that shook the world. Most people immediately think of Rome, or maybe Genghis Khan's Mongol hordes sweeping across.
It's philosophers. But have you ever stopped to wonder about a civilization that invented paper, gunpowder, the compass, and printing that built a wall stretching thousands of miles? And that created a unified empire when most of Europe was still tribal territory? Have you ever imagined a world where one emperor could command millions of workers to build his tomb? Where silk was so precious that it formed the backbone of international trade for 1,000 years? And where a single dynasty could last longer than the entire span of the United States from Columbus to today? Did you know that ancient Chinese civilization developed a written language that has remained continuous for over 3,000 years, making it the oldest still in use? What if I told you that the terracotta warriors guarding one emperor's tomb were not discovered until 1974, and that archaeologists still haven't fully excavated the central tomb itself because of fears about mercury poisoning? If these questions make you curious, then the story of how ancient Chinese civilization emerged, flourished, and created foundations that still underpin East Asian culture today will completely reshape your understanding of human achievement. The story begins not with emperors, but with rivers. Around 7,000 years ago, along the Yellow River and the Yangtze, early Chinese farmers began cultivating millet and rice, creating settled communities that would grow into something unprecedented. These were not the first farmers in the world, but they were among the most successful, developing techniques of irrigation, flood control, and intensive cultivation that supported growing populations. The Yellow River, which carries so much sediment that it literally builds its own bed higher than the surrounding land, was both a blessing and a curse. Its floods brought fertile soil, but catastrophic breaks of the dikes could kill hundreds of thousands and displace millions. Controlling this river became a central task of Chinese governance. And success or failure in flood control could make or break dynasties. By around 3000 BC, the Neolithic cultures of China were developing remarkable sophistication. The Yangtze culture in the north produced painted pottery with sophisticated designs. The Longshan culture developed black pottery so thin and hard that it is called eggshell pottery. Archaeological discoveries at sites like Banpo near modern Xi'an reveal planned villages with defensive ditches, suggesting organized communities with some form of leadership. But the most remarkable development was the emergence of jade work. Jade, a hard stone that must be laboriously ground rather than carved, became the supreme material of ancient Chinese ritual, by the living, and fashioned into objects whose meaning you still partially decipher. The bai, a flat circular disc, and the kong, a hollow tube with square outer section and circular inner bore, appear across thousands of years and vast distances, suggesting shared religious beliefs among early Chinese societies. The first historically attested dynasty, the Shang, emerged around 1600 BC in the North China Plain. The Shang are known primarily through archaeological excavations at Anyang, their last capital, and through the extraordinary discovery of oracle bones. These were ox scapulae and turtle plastrons that were heated until they cracked, and the patterns of cracks were interpreted as messages from ancestral spirits or the supreme deity. The inscriptions on these bones, recording questions about warfare, agriculture, royal tours, and celestial phenomena, constitute the earliest significant corpus of Chinese writing. They reveal a society ruled by a king who was also chief shaman, mediating between the human and supernatural worlds. The Shang royal court was mobile, moving between palaces rather than fixed in one capital. It commanded bronze workers of extraordinary skill who produced vessels of complex shape and decoration for ritual use. These bronzes, weighing hundreds of pounds in some cases, required sophisticated organization of mining, transportation, and manufacture. They were not merely art objects, but political statements, displays of wealth and power that reinforced the king's legitimacy. The Shang were overthrown around 1046 BC by the Zhou, a people from the western periphery who claimed that the Shang king had lost the mandate of heaven through his misrule. This concept, that heaven granted authority to just rulers and withdrew it from tyrants, became fundamental to Chinese political thought for 3,000 years. The Zhou established their capital near modern Xi'an and created a feudal system, granting territory to relatives and allies, who ruled as local lords while acknowledging the Zhou king as supreme ritual authority. This system worked while Zhou power was strong, but as generations passed, local lords became virtually independent. By 771 BC, barbarian invasions and internal revolt forced the Zhou to move their capital eastward to Luoyang. Beginning the spring and autumn period named after the chronicle of the state of Lu, for the next 5 centuries, China was divided among competing states that waged increasingly destructive wars, developed sophisticated philosophies, and laid the groundwork for eventual reunification. This period of division was paradoxically one of extraordinary intellectual creativity. Confucius, born in 551 BC, developed a philosophy of ethical self-cultivation, social harmony, and reverence for tradition that would eventually become China's dominant ideology. He taught that rulers should govern through moral example rather than force, that relationships should be governed by reciprocity and respect, and that education should be open to talent rather than restricted to birth. Almost simultaneously, Laozi, or his followers, developed Taoism, a philosophy of natural spontaneity and non-interference that offered an alternative to Confucian activism. Mozi preached universal love and utilitarian efficiency, and in the most brutal states, legalist philosophers developed theories of absolute state power, systematic law, and harsh punishment that would eventually prove most useful to the first unifier of China. The Warring States period, from roughly 475 to 221 BC, saw the final escalation of interstate competition. Armies grew from thousands to hundreds of thousands. Warfare became total, with massacres of defeated populations and the destruction of enemy states. Iron technology developed in this period revolutionized agriculture and weaponry. Crossbows, with their penetrating power and ease of use, made peasant conscripts effective soldiers. Chariots, the aristocratic weapon of the Shang and early Zhou, gave way to cavalry adopted from northern nomads. And through all this violence, the states that would survive were those that most effectively mobilized their populations, developed their economies, and centralized their administrations. The final victor was Qin, a semi-barbarian state on the western frontier that had long been despised by the more cultured states of the central plain. Under a series of capable rulers and their chief minister Sheng Yang, Qin implemented radical legalist reforms that transformed society. The aristocracy was stripped of hereditary privileges. Land was made freely alienable, encouraging intensive cultivation. Groups of families were made mutually responsible for each other's behavior, ensuring social control. And military merit became the primary path to advancement, with rewards strictly tied to battlefield achievement. By the time Yangtze became king of Qin in 246 BC, the state possessed an administrative machine of unparalleled efficiency and an army hardened by decades of brutal warfare. Between 230 and 221 BC, Yangtze conquered the 6 remaining states and proclaimed himself Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of Qin. This was a new title, deliberately grandiose, claiming a sovereignty that transcended the Zhou kings and matched the legendary sage emperors of remote antiquity. The first emperor's reign was brief, from 221 to 210 BC, but extraordinarily consequential. He standardized weights, measures, currency, and above all writing, creating a unified script that could be read across the vast new empire despite regional dialect differences. He abolished the hereditary aristocracy that had ruled for centuries, replacing it with a bureaucracy appointed by the center. He built roads and canals to bind the empire together. And he began connecting existing local walls into what would eventually become the Great Wall, a project of staggering scale that required hundreds of thousands of workers and cost countless lives. The first emperor's obsession with immortality and his fear of death led to one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites on Earth, near his capital at modern Xi'an. He constructed a tomb complex that has been estimated to cover 56 square kilometers. The central burial mound remains unexcavated, partly because ancient accounts describe rivers of mercury and automatic crossbows guarding the emperor's body, and soil testing has indeed revealed extraordinarily high mercury levels. But the outer precincts, discovered by farmers in 1974, have yielded the famous Terracotta Army, thousands of life-sized figures, each with individual facial features, arranged in battle formation to guard the emperor in death. These figures were originally painted in vivid colors, equipped with real weapons, and accompanied by horses and chariots. Their manufacture required massive organization of labor, with different workshops producing heads, bodies, arms, and legs that were then assembled and customized. The Terracotta Army is not merely art, but politics made concrete. A statement of imperial power that still astonishes nearly 2,500 years later. The Qin Dynasty collapsed almost immediately after the first emperor's death. His son proved incapable, and popular revolt, combined with aristocratic reaction, destroyed the regime. But the unified empire that Qin had created was not reversible. After 4 years of civil war, Liu Bang, a commoner of peasant origin who had risen through military service, defeated his rivals and established the Han Dynasty in 206 BC. The Han would last, with one interruption, for 4 centuries, and its name remains the Chinese word for their ethnic identity. Han Chinese thought the Han emperors preserved Qin's administrative structure, but moderated its harshness with Confucian ideology. Under Emperor Wu, who ruled from 141 to 87 BC, the dynasty reached its greatest expansion. Military campaigns pushed Chinese power into Central Asia, Korea, and Vietnam. The Silk Road, a network of trade routes connecting China to the Mediterranean, was opened through these conquests. Chinese silk, produced by a technology that China monopolized for centuries, became the prestige fabric of the Roman elite. In exchange, China received horses, glass, and eventually Buddhism, which would transform Chinese culture over the following centuries. Emperor Wu also established the imperial examination system, creating a path for talented commoners to enter the bureaucracy, based on knowledge of Confucian classics rather than family connections. This system, with modifications, would last until 1905, making it one of the most enduring institutions in human history. The Han period was also one of extraordinary technological innovation. Paper was invented initially for wrapping but soon for writing, replacing the heavy bamboo slips and expensive silk that had previously served. The seismograph was invented by Zheng He, a scientist and poet who created an instrument that could detect earthquakes hundreds of miles away. The wheelbarrow, the stern post rudder, and the casting of iron from blast furnaces all appeared in this period. Chinese medicine developed sophisticated theories of the body, disease, and treatment that would continue to evolve for 2 millennia. And historiography reached a peak with Simon Qian, whose records of the Grand Historian established a model for official history that would influence Chinese writing for centuries. But the Han Dynasty eventually succumbed to the problems that would plague all Chinese dynasties: court factionalism, unit power, peasant rebellion, and the rise of regional military commanders who became effectively independent. The dynasty was interrupted from 9 to 23 AD by Wang Mang, a reformer who attempted radical redistribution of land and abolition of slavery, but his reforms failed and he died in rebellion. The restored Eastern Han lasted until 220 AD, when it finally collapsed into the Three Kingdoms period, another era of division that would inspire one of China's greatest novels and countless popular adaptations. The period from 220 to 589 AD, known as the Six Dynasties or the Northern and Southern Dynasties, was politically fragmented but culturally creative. Buddhism, imported from India via Central Asia, became a major religious and intellectual force, challenging and enriching native Chinese traditions. The famous cave temples at Dunhuang, Yanggang, and Longmen were carved in this period, creating repositories of art that still survive. Philosophy developed new schools, particularly Neo-Taoism, that would influence later thinkers. And the South, previously marginal, became economically and culturally important as Northern. Chinese fled barbarian invasion and developed the rice-growing regions of the Yangtze Delta. Reunification finally came with the Sui Dynasty in 589, followed by the even more successful Tang Dynasty in 618. The Tang is often considered China's golden age, when its capital Chang'an was probably the largest and most cosmopolitan city in the world. With a population exceeding 1 million, Chang'an hosted merchants, diplomats, and monks from across Asia and beyond. Persian princes, Arab traders, Japanese students, and Indian monks all lived in designated quarters, bringing foreign religions, arts, and technologies. The Tang court patronized poetry to an extraordinary degree, and the works of Li Bai, Du Fu, and Wang Wei remain among the most admired in Chinese literature. Buddhism flourished under imperial patronage, with the monk Zhuangzang making a famous journey to India to collect scriptures and founding a translation bureau that rendered hundreds of texts into Chinese. The Tang also saw significant changes in social structure. The aristocratic families that had dominated since the Han gradually lost power to a broader class of degree holders recruited through the examination system. Printing, invented in this period, began to spread knowledge more widely. The civil service became more professional and more meritocratic, at least in theory. Women enjoyed relatively high status, with several empresses wielding real power, most notoriously Wu Zixin, who actually declared her own dynasty and ruled as emperor in her own right from 690 to 705. But the Tang also faced challenges that would recur throughout Chinese history. Military pressure from Central Asian nomads, particularly the Turks and later the Tibetans, required enormous expenditure and occasionally humiliating diplomacy. The Aleutian Rebellion of 755 to 763, led by a general of Central Asian origin, devastated the north and forced the court to rely on regional military commanders who became effectively independent. And the equal field system, which had granted land to peasants in exchange for tax and labor service, gradually broke down as aristocrats and monasteries, accumulated estates and peasants fled to become tenants or bandits. The Tang finally collapsed in 907, leading to another period of division called the Five Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms. But reunification came relatively quickly with the Song Dynasty in 960. The Song never controlled all the territory that the Tang had, losing the north to nomadic states, but it achieved extraordinary economic and cultural development. Paper money, invented to solve the problem of transporting heavy copper coinage, became the first fiat currency in world history. Industry flourished, with iron production reaching levels that would not be matched in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. Cities grew enormously, with Kaifang and later Hanzhou reaching populations in the millions. And a commercial revolution transformed society as merchants became wealthier and more influential, challenging the traditional dominance of landowners and officials. But the Song faced a military problem that would eventually destroy it. The northern frontier where the Tang had once exercised hegemony was now controlled by powerful nomadic states, first the Hitan Liao, then the Jurchen and finally the Mongols. The Song, paying tribute to maintain peace, developed a culture of refinement and commercial prosperity that was militarily vulnerable. When the Mongols under Genghis Khan and his successors conquered all of Eurasia from Poland to Korea, the Song was their last major target. The conquest completed in 1279 was extraordinarily destructive with the final battle, seeing a Song child emperor and his loyal minister drowning themselves rather than surrender. ***. The Yuan Dynasty established by Kublai Khan was the first time all China was ruled by a non-Han people. The Mongols brought some innovations particularly in communications and administration, but they also imposed a harsh ethnic hierarchy that placed Chinese at the bottom. The dynasty lasted less than a century, overthrown by peasant rebellion led by Zhou Yuanzheng, a former Buddhist monk who became the Hongwu emperor and founded the Ming Dynasty in 1368. The Ming would last nearly 3 centuries, restoring Chinese rule and Chinese pride, but also developing the autocratic tendencies that would characterize late imperial China. Under the Ming, China briefly became a major naval power. Between 1405 and 1433, the eunuch Admiral Zheng He led 7 enormous fleets with hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of sailors to Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, and even East Africa. These voyages demonstrated Chinese technological capability and projected imperial prestige. But they were abruptly terminated after 1433, partly because of court factionalism, partly because the voyages were enormously expensive and brought little tangible return. China turned inward, abandoning oceanic expansion, just as European powers were beginning their own age of discovery. The Ming also saw the construction of the Great Wall as you know it today. Earlier walls of rammed earth were rebuilt and extended in brick and stone, creating the impressive structure that tourists visit now. But the wall could not save the dynasty from internal rebellion. The 1640s saw widespread peasant revolt combined with Manchu invasion from the northeast. The last Ming emperor hanged himself in 1644, and the Manchus established the Qing Dynasty, the last imperial dynasty which would rule until 1912. So what remains of this civilization that built ancient China? The Chinese language, still written in characters descended from Shang oracle bones, still read across a vast country despite dialect differences that would make mutual oral comprehension impossible. The political ideal of unified rule of a single center, maintaining order and civilization against chaos and barbarism. The Confucian emphasis on education, on moral self-cultivation, on the responsibility of the educated to serve society. The Taoist appreciation of nature, of spontaneity, of the limits of human ambition. The Buddhist understanding of suffering and the possibility of liberation. And the extraordinary material heritage, from bronze vessels to silk paintings, from terracotta warriors to porcelain vases, that still astonishes visitors in museums worldwide. But perhaps the deepest legacy is the demonstration that human societies can achieve extraordinary scale and continuity. Chinese civilization maintained a unified written language, a shared cultural canon, and a political ideal of centralized rule for over 3,000 years through periods of division and conquest that would have destroyed less resilient cultures. This was not simply a matter of geography or demography, though China's relative isolation and large population helped. It was a matter of institutions, of the examination system and the bureaucracy of the family system and the village organization that transmitted culture and maintained social order across vast distances and long periods of time. The story of ancient Chinese civilization is ultimately a story about how human societies develop, flourish, and transform over extraordinary time spans. It reminds you that the foundations of your modern world were laid not just in Greece and Rome, but also along the Yellow River and the Yangtze, by people who invented writing systems, political philosophies, and technologies that still influence your lives. It shows you that continuity and change can coexist, that a civilization can maintain its identity while absorbing foreign influences and adapting to new circumstances. And it demonstrates that the past is never truly past, that the institutions, ideas, and artifacts of ancient China still shape the lives of billions of people today. So the next time you use paper, drink tea, admire a porcelain vase, or hear about China's rising global influence, remember that these are echoes of a civilization that invented writing, developed philosophy, built walls and tombs of staggering scale, and created institutions that lasted for millennia. A civilization that began with millet farmers along the Yellow River, that created the Terracotta Army and the Silk Road, that invented printing and paper money, and that maintained a unified culture through conquests, rebellions, and revolutions that would have destroyed lesser societies. Ancient China was not merely one civilization among many, but a unique experiment in scale and continuity whose lessons you are still learning today.